She wasn't the kind of woman anyone noticed in a crowd. She never wore anything bold, never raised her voice, never interrupted, never stood in the center of attention. But there was something quietly relentless in the way she showed up every single day, not just to work, but to fight battles. No one ever saw battles against disrespect, dismissal, and a system that thrived on her silence. She had learned how to survive in a world that never expected her to lead, never offered her power, and barely gave her space. But behind those soft eyes and tired hands lived a storm, waiting for the right moment to rise. And that moment came the day they fired her. Not with empathy, not behind closed doors, but in front of everyone, without warning, without mercy. Like her presence was disposable, like she had no worth left to give. They thought they had erased her, but what they really did was awaken something they never imagined could exist in a woman like her. She walked into the office that day carrying the same bag she had used for 5 years, wearing the same shoes she had repaired 3 times, and holding the same calm expression that had seen her through storms far worse than traffic delays or late-night reports. But none of that could protect her from what was waiting behind the fake smiles and the polite tones that had learned to mask cruelty with professionalism. Because the moment she stepped past the reception desk, the silence around her was different, heavier, like the air itself had been trained to step back and not warn her. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, checked her emails, and within minutes was summoned to the conference room. Not for a meeting, not for an opportunity, but for a dismissal crafted to break her spirit while pretending it was just business, just protocol, just a decision made from the top without anything personal behind it. Yet everything about it felt deeply personal. The manager who wouldn't look her in the eye, the HR person who pretended to read from a sheet of paper, the colleague who avoided her as if her misfortune might be contagious. It was all orchestrated like a scene that had been practiced, rehearsed, made to feel clean when it was anything but. She heard the words position no longer needed company restructuring. Thank you for your service. But what echoed inside her was the unspoken message that she was never seen, never valued, never meant to be more than a background figure holding the pieces together while others took the credit. She stood there still, her hands trembling only slightly, her face unreadable because she had learned long ago how to cry without letting tears fall, how to bleed internally without leaving a stain. And as she walked back to her desk to gather her few things, the room watched her like a show. They were glad wasn't about them, a performance of public defeat that they would forget by lunch. She didn't say anything, not because she didn't have words, but because she knew this wasn't the time to speak. This was the time to listen to the sound of doors closing so she could find the ones she would one day open herself. She left the building with no applause, no goodbye cake, no kind farewell, only silence, the kind that doesn't forget, the kind that remembers everything, so it can be rewritten later in a way no one saw coming. She placed the box of her belongings on the floor beside the table that had once held nothing but dinner and children's drawings, and for the first time in months, she looked around her own living room and noticed how faded the curtains had become, how the walls whispered stories of struggle, how even the clock ticked a little slower, like it too carried the weight of her exhaustion. But that night was not meant for sleep, not for grieving, not for asking why, because the fire inside her wasn't seeking pity, it was reaching for something far beyond revenge. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from remembering every spreadsheet she perfected, every weekend she worked unpaid, every idea stolen and presented by someone else, every time she was told to be grateful, to smile more, to never speak louder than the men in meetings where her voice built solutions while their egos took the bows. She opened her old laptop, the one missing the E key, the one that had overheated too many times but still worked just like her, flawed, overlooked, but unstoppable when it mattered the most. And as the night deepened, she searched. Red noted down every resource, every policy, every crack in the walls of the company that had discarded her like she was replaceable. She wasn't looking for a job. She was building a roadmap. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was calculating the gaps they didn't know existed, the loopholes, the dependencies. The silent alliances that kept the place standing while she was the one making sure the lights stayed on without anyone noticing. Her eyes didn't close. Not once. Not even for a moment, because sleep was a luxury, and she had just discovered something more valuable. Clarity. She printed documents, highlighted contacts, made lists of names and departments, circled patterns of injustice that had gone unquestioned for too long. And when the sky outside began to shift from black to deep blue, she hadn't rested, but she had risen in a different way, not from a nap, but from a realization that if she couldn't change their building, she would build her own and make them watch as it overshadowed everything they once called untouchable. Her phone was cold in her hand, not because she was nervous, but because the silence of dawn made everything feel heavier, sharper, more deliberate-like. The universe was holding its breath as she scrolled through names that once smiled at her. In elevators, praised her work in passing, yet stayed quiet when she was humiliated in front of them all. She wasn't calling to beg or complain. She was calling to remind them of the foundation she had quietly laid beneath the noisy chaos of management. The systems she alone understood the numbers. She alone balanced the solutions. Only she ever cared enough to fix without applause or promotion. She called the vendor first, the one who always said she was the only one who spoke to him like a human. And when he picked up, his voice cracked. Not because it was early, but because he knew if she was calling, something had changed. Then she called the supplier's assistant who once whispered thank you when she saved him from a shipping disaster, and when he heard her plan, he didn't hesitate. He offered her more than a favor. He offered loyalty because he remembered who stayed calm when everyone else blamed. She reached out to the small clients whose needs were dismissed, whose accounts were neglected, but she never let them feel ignored. And now, when she spoke with certainty, when she offered better service, better attention, better integrity, they didn't ask questions. They said yes because trust had already been built before the foundation had a name. Every call wasn't just a reconnection. It was a reclamation of respect, of relationships, of resources quietly earned over years of silent labor. No threats, no anger, no drama. Just purpose, just a woman who remembered every crack in the structure and every hand that deserved better and was willing to move if she led. Soon the responses weren't just agreements. They were confirmations that she wasn't alone, that others were waiting for someone to rise so they could follow. And by the time the clock struck noon, exactly 24 hours after her public dismissal, the company phone lines were ringing, but not with congratulations, with cancellations, with confusion, with questions they couldn't answer, because the voice on the other end was no longer theirs to control. The space wasn't glamorous, not yet just a vacant floor with scuffed tiles and echoes that reminded her of how beginnings always feel, lonely but full of potential. She didn't wait for paint to dry or signs to be printed. She set up her desk with an old laptop, opened her notebook full of years of unspoken strategies, and started building. Not from ambition, but from necessity, because she knew the window of impact was narrow and the people who believed in her were already watching. She called a woman who once cried in the break room after being overlooked for a promotion and offered her a real position, not just a title she accepted within minutes. She reached out to a retired accountant whose ideas were dismissed for being too traditional and invited him to reimagine systems with her. He drove 6 hours to meet her that same day. She wasn't just building a company. She was assembling a shelter for the overlooked, a haven for the competent but ignored. And every person who walked in didn't need convincing. They came with stories like hers, ready to rewrite their endings. They worked through the night with paper coffee cups and hearts lit with quiet vengeance. Not to destroy what had failed them, but to build what should have existed all along. Word spread faster than she anticipated, not because of press releases or social media, but through whispers in late-night calls, through screenshots of resignation letters sent with her name in the subject line, through the way silence at the old office turned heavier each time a former colleague's desk sat empty and unclaimed. And in that silence, the higher-ups began to panic, not because of profits not yet, but because something invisible had shifted. Influence was no longer in their building. It was across town in a bare room pulsing with energy and belonging. The old office that once fired her was still shiny, still structured, but it felt hollow now, like a stage with missing actors. And though they held the titles, they no longer held the hearts. And in this quiet rebellion, in this relentless creation, she wasn't shouting for justice. She was simply becoming undeniable. There was no celebration planned, no champagne waiting, just numbers on a screen, names on a contract, and an email that ended a chapter without saying a word. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a second before clicking send, and just like that, she acquired the very company that once discarded her like a paperclip past its use. The irony didn't bring a smile. It brought silence, a stillness that wrapped around her chest, because this wasn't revenge. It was repair. The news reached the old office before dawn, scattered across inboxes and Slack channels like a gust of wind that slammed every window shut at once. They saw her name not as a mention, but as a signature, as the new owner, as the reason the locks would be changed by morning. She didn't show up with cameras or statements. She walked in, alone, greeted the same front desk that once looked through her, stepped into the boardroom with the calm of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. The executives didn't argue. They had seen the shift, felt the slow unraveling of their influence, and now sat in chairs that suddenly felt too big for them. She spoke only once, reading from a single sheet of paper, her voice steady, her message clear. The culture of dismissal was done, the walls that echoed exclusion were being torn down, and those who once felt invisible would now be the architects of everything new. And in that room, thick with silence and disbelief, not a soul interrupted, because deep down they all knew they'd built something fragile and masked it as power. She left the building without a glance back, returning to her office. Her people, her mission, not to conquer, but to correct. And though the city lights still blinked as always, that night felt different to everyone who had ever been silenced. Every quiet contributor who wondered if they mattered, every person who watched her journey unfold as proof that sometimes the most broken exits lead to the most powerful entrances. She didn't become a boss. She became a movement, one that no longer knocked on closed doors but built her own entrances wide enough for everyone who had ever been pushed out. The emails began pouring in, not from board members or investors, but from strangers, employees in other cities, women in tiny towns, students, single mothers, even retirees who saw in her something they'd never seen before. A reflection of the quiet fire they'd long buried under survival. Every sentence she read carried the same echo. You gave me hope, you made me believe again, you reminded me. Not small. Some wrote about jobs they walked away from, others about dreams they'd put on shelves too high to reach, and many simply said, thank you not for revenge, but for rewriting the ending. Everyone warned them about. She hadn't intended to become a symbol, hadn't imagined her silent resistance turning into a rallying cry. But here it was, unfolding, unstoppable, authentic. And while headlines chased her name and networks asked for interviews, she chose stillness again, choosing to listen, not broadcast. She created scholarships, quietly funded women-led startups, and returned to that tiny community center where she once offered free workshops with more heart than resources. Now the walls were painted, the chairs were new, the internet worked, and every weekend it overflowed with people coming not just to learn, but to belong. She didn't announce her visits, didn't put her name on anything. She just showed up, sat in the back, and watched the room bloom without asking for credit. Behind the scenes, her company policies changed to flexible schedules, mental health days, mentorship programs, all rooted in one truth. People are not replaceable machines. They are stories, and every story matters. And even the executives who once sat across from her began adopting those changes in their own ways. Not from guilt, but from a quiet realization that the world they built needed repair. Her name became more than a headline. It became a verb whispered in offices where someone stood up for themselves, in emails where someone asked for better, in hearts that had gone silent, but now thudded with courage again. She never wanted applause, only change, but somehow both followed her like shadows, reminding her that even the softest footsteps can leave echoes in places power never touches. When she entered that building again, not as an employee, but as the owner, she didn't walk with vengeance. She walked with vision, not the kind that burns everything down, but the kind that rebuilds with quiet precision and purpose, the kind that doesn't shout, but shapes everything. It touches. She didn't remove people just because they'd once failed her. She restructured the soul of the place, turning rigid walls into breathing spaces and replacing fear with a strange, unfamiliar energy. Respect, her office once denied to her, was now redesigned into a space where no one felt smaller than the furniture, where the door stayed open and voices were not only heard but believed. She met with every department, not with charts and commands, but with stories asking them what they were afraid to say before. And every time someone hesitated, she didn't fill the silence. She waited, and in that waiting, trust was born. One by one, old systems dissolved, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the gentle persistence of someone who knew how it felt to be unseen. Her changes didn't go viral. They went deep, and while the media slowly lost interest in her rise, those within the company knew the real story wasn't a comeback. It was a transformation. There were moments when the past tried to return, when skeptics whispered that she was too emotional, too soft, too different, but those voices now drowned under the weight of results. Higher productivity, lower turnover, employee happiness metrics that stunned even external auditors. And perhaps the greatest shift came not in profits or policies, but in posture. People sat straighter, smiled more, volunteered ideas without rehearsing them in fear, and stayed longer after hours, not out of obligation but ownership. What they never saw coming wasn't her success. It was the revolution she carried in her silence, the way she restored dignity without demanding it, the way she turned wounds into windows and failure into foundation. She didn't rise to prove them wrong. She rose to prove everyone else right. Those who quietly believed, those who needed someone like her to go first, to show them that you can lose everything at noon and still walk into ownership by night. Not because you planned it, but because something in you refused to surrender to anything less than truth. There was no grand farewell, no confetti storm, no staged ceremony to mark her transition from the daily grind to the next calling. Because she never needed the noise, she had become the sound of silent change, the quiet force behind everything that stood strong in her absence. Her name wasn't carved into marble or lit in neon, but in the quiet corners of break rooms and brainstorming sessions, her story lived on, not in words, but in how people worked, in how they listened, in how they lifted each other instead of climbing over one another. Every hallway she once walked now echoed with a different energy, one born from respect, not rank from belief, not branding from human value, not hierarchy. Her impact wasn't measured in numbers, but in the courage people found to speak, to fail, to rise again, knowing they'd be met not with ridicule, but with reflection. She didn't just run a company. She reshaped its culture, turned it from a ladder into a circle, from a cold machine into a living, breathing force that didn't just chase growth, but carried grace. Her departure didn't leave a gap. It left a garden, one tended daily by those who once feared even planting a seed. She taught them not by lectures or memos, but by standing tall after being torn down, by choosing kindness when anger would have been easier, by rising when it should have been impossible. Her story became a myth whispered to new hires, a benchmark for every leader, a silent anthem humming beneath every decision made in that building. And while she moved on to build more, to invest, to mentor, to guide others, her fingerprint remained not on glass doors or golden plaques, but on hearts, on mindsets, on the invisible structure of a company that once threw her away and later became her canvas. She had rewritten what it meant to lead, what it meant to succeed, what it meant to be a simple woman in a complex world. And in doing so, she reminded them all that sometimes the ones you fire at noon are the very ones who teach you how to fly by night.